5 whales have on this particular population that's now off the endangered species list. So it's not as though they're an endangered species. Another part is that they say that critical to this case to prevail on this claim that the federal agencies were required to prepare an environmental impact statement, the plaintiffs need not demonstrate that significant effects will occur, and showing that there are substantial questions whether a project may have a significant effect on the environment is sufficient. So what I find interesting here is that the way that this sort of operates is that there's an underlying presumption, a cultural and a legal presumption against this kind of the use of these sort of environmental resources or species. Now, as I said, the precedent on this is not clear at all. And as I said, when you compare environmental legislation that might somewhat be clear, compared to Native American treaty law, the law is pretty clear that says that you err with the treaty language, not the environmental legislation. But when you go deeper into the court decision, this particular court only briefly mentions McCaw's actual claims to the treaty. And they just say, well, yeah, they have treaty language, it's sort of historically based, treaty right, but a lot has changed since then. And so they really sort of freeze the McCaw's concerns for their own treaty obligations, which for the McCaw are quite meaningful. They gave up a lot, almost the entirety of Washington State, in order to keep at least the right to whale, which is specified in their treaty. So, this is a rather big deal to this particular tribe, and to have it dismissed so quickly by the Ninth Court is rather surprising. And that's what led me back to re-examining all this Moby Dick and sort of the power of Moby Dick and cultural imagination. Because the court seems to not rule strongly that there's a risk to the gray whale population. They seem to sort of say, we're not really sure. And while there might be clear case law over here, we're just going to rule to not cause probable damage that no one's sure will even occur in the first place. So it's a very bizarre sort of decision that comes out of it. And so, drawing from another body of work, jumped ahead to the conclusions here, I argue that Moby Dick operates kind of a literary truth. That operates as a cautionary precedent that's taught by the book, and that becomes an authoritative reason for the court to act against this hunt. The very first decision that I outlined that the court deals with is a very technical paperwork administrative decision. It's easy for them to say, you didn't file your paperwork right, do it again and come back to us. The second decision actually required them to deal with multiculturalism on one hand, and the murkiness of Native American law compared to environmental law. And the courts have never had an easy time negotiating all of that. And why I find this analysis, and that's a technology of truth to get to my conclusions here, why I sort of reached this decision, I'll jump to my last point here, is that I think it provides a little bit more nuanced and better explanation of what's going on with the court. A lot of Native American critics of the law, I think, are way too heavy-handed in their criticism of the court. Much like a lot of other sort of CLS or critical race theorists. In that it can be very easy to argue that the court is always racist, that it's inherent to sort of the legal decisions, the way precedence operates, the construction of law. And while there might be some merit to some of those claims, in this decision, you don't see a lot of overt racism or even really veiled racism in many ways. I argue in this particular article, when I had it published, I discussed whiteness and how it operates in this decision a little bit. But what you really find more in this decision is a very confused, anxious court. They just don't really know what they want to do in regards to the McCaw hunt. And it's interesting, the Supreme Court never took up this particular issue. It was offered. They never optioned to rule on the decision because it's not an easy area to rule on, and there's broad international implications from the decision. So one of my findings is that by reading and understanding how Moby Dick operates as a literary truth, you can understand a little bit better what guides the court here. I mean, you can say that whiteness, racism, colonialism is what is the underlying sort of reason for Moby Dick operating as a cautionary tale here. But that didn't interest me as much as sort of the rhetorical operation of this literary illusion. So, I mean, that's probably a future study, or I'm not sure I'll ever dive back into doing a lot more analysis of Moby Dick, but that interpretation's there. I mean, there's hundreds of different interpretations of Moby Dick as a story. You know, that's a very multicultural crew that is on the Pequod. It's interesting that there's a Native American hunter, there's an Indian hunter, there is a Polynesian hunter, I believe, and there's another crew member that are sort of the noble savages on the boat, whereas you have Captain Ahab, who's completely insane. You have Ishmael, who's your narrator and sympathetic character. But how the harpooners and the multicultural sort of crew operate in the story, there's a lot of colonialist sort of different critical racial readings of that. So I think that provides a little bit more nuanced understanding of how the court operates, where the position doesn't have to always be all racism, all colonialism, and then you can have sort of more nuances to understand that even when the court is highly conscious of sort of what they're deciding, that that they still draw upon things that would undermine Native American rights. And to jump back to my first conclusion here is that the impact of this decision really had a broad range of consequences for other Native American groups. For the Makah, this case weighed pretty heavily on a lot of their salmon rights in the area, which was just as controversial of an issue. The Makah hunting often take a lot of salmon that would go upstream to the Seattle area, and there's deep, passionate hatred of the Makah Indians by other people in the state. Where I stayed when I did my research in Washington State was actually a fishing town. And so one of the nights while I was eating dinner at like the only restaurant in the town, I ran into a guy who was originally from Michigan. So we're chatting about various things about the state. And I sort of bring up to him, like, so the Makah, like, so, how do you all feel about them? Well, I was blown away. I was like, yeah, oh yeah, I agree, yeah. I didn't want to brawl to start by saying, well, I don't know if that's correct. I mean, deep sort of racism in that area. And then when the Makah was hunting, it was unbelievable, like, the reaction to this hunt. Like, there were newspaper editorials that said, like, can I get a license to hunt Makah myself? If they get a license to hunt whale, I want a license to hunt them. They should be like their ancestors and just die, things like this. I mean, it was a very racialized, brutal sort of environment in which this hunt sort of arises. But that seemed to have happened much more, obviously, on a local level, rather than what informs the court in this instance. But the precedent that this decision set then opened the floodgates for contestation of other Makah rights. Not too many of them. The Makah haven't lost a lot other than in the area of sort of implications for the salmon rights. But I think it's interesting to understand how sort of cultural imagination about both the Indian as a subject, but also other elements of sort of American cultural imagination, like in this instance, Moby Dick. But there's a variety of other sorts of imagination that we have about the Old West. And sort of expansion, and that also have a lot of implications in the Native American rights. And so future sort of interest to me might be looking at how other sort of cultural narratives might leak into legal decisions. I've yet to find, in at least the area of Makah and the other decisions I have, something that's just as noticeable as the Moby Dick references here and the reference to the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. But and then as my second point indicates, it's interesting to see how whiteness can infiltrate the courts in small and unexpected sort of discursive rhetorical ways. I mean, here, I'm still having a debate to this day about what is the direction of the relationship. Is the allusions to Moby Dick merely a sign of sort of the court's thinking? Like, does it merely demonstrate that there's sort of a more cultural presumption against harming the sublime and